didn't want him here either.
Good afternoon. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Sundial. Alright, since the last time I shot this, I've done a little more detailing to his face. At first it kind of looked like a mask floating over the skull. I've kind of smoothed it back into its head a little bit. Still need to rework the aura and fix his defining skull line a touch. But for the moment, I'm going to go down to the sundial portion again and start in with a bright orange and rose red to rim around the perimeter of the sundial cobbling and start fading it into brighter and lighter blues towards the center. But for now, just the orange and the red.
Is that book you mentioned, is it available in English?
Yeah, it's Yossi Brzezinski's name is, I forgot the title, it was published by Common Courage. Completely, I haven't seen a word about it anywhere. It's a very interesting book, and as I say, when it came out in Hebrew, the original edition was quite widely discussed and pretty favorably.
One of the interesting dynamics of the demonstrations in 2006 of the immigrants community is the experts were befuddled as to how were they organized. And it seems that actually talk radio, Spanish language radio, was the main instrument of organizing these demonstrations.
It's interesting. You're just giving yourself a plug here.
Well, I'm not bothering
but same racket. Yeah. Now, that's one, radio, as you've told me many times, is one of the ways of getting around control over information and opinion.
Muhammad Yunus of Bangladesh was awarded the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize. He started the Grameen Bank in that country, and it's based on microcredit loans to people, mostly poor women in rural areas. And this is, people are always asked, well, if you don't like capitalism, what about some kind of alternative? Is this perhaps the basis of building a building block?
Well, this is pure capitalism, much purer than the U.S. economy. It's real capitalism. U.S. economy is state-based to a large extent. But yeah, I think it's a sensible device. It's not the answer to everything, but empowering women is extremely important in third world countries, actually in most poor communities. I mean, one of the things that's very noticeable in communities that are kind of crushed, we're barely surviving, is the women seem much more able to do things than the men are. And you can see why. The women, their responsibilities continue. No matter how rotten the situation, they're still taking care of the children and cooking and so on. The men, when opportunities are gone, their usual opportunities, whatever it may be, they're lost. They have nothing to do. They turn to drink, to crime, and so on. You see it all over the place. I've seen it in places like, say, Nicaragua. Well, you see it in poor communities. But actually, we've even seen it in this department when we bring people in from Ken Hale, who died recently, brought people in from the Native American communities and did a fantastic job of getting them through a graduate program in linguistics, a hard program that they didn't have the background. And pretty typically, the women made out very well. The men usually had problems, but they're just, I've seen it in Nicaragua. You walk around the streets of my daughter's neighborhoods Sunday morning, and you see the wives and sisters coming out, pulling in drunken husbands and brothers. You walk down the street during the day, the women are busy. They're cleaning the leaves off the front steps. They're getting the children washed and ready to school. And I don't know what the men are doing. Gambling. It's just a disrupted life. And it's common all over the world. So giving microcredit loans to women is a very smart thing to do. It's not the end of everything, but it has paid off, and it's a good capitalist approach.
In the business section of the New York Times, actually, in December 9th, 2006, there's an interview with Yunus, who I didn't particularly know to be radical politically, but he says here, my position has been that poverty has not been created by the poor people. The system has created them. The system being institutions, the concepts or framework of living. That's where the seed of poverty is.
He's correct, and I don't think he's radical either. I don't think that's a radical comment. It's like common sense. It's nice that he said it. It's good that he said it, which is unusual. Yeah.
And going back to Central America just for a moment, and actually Latin America in general, the current Pope, Benedict, who's managed to mire himself in controversy around his less than flattering statements about Islam, he was known as apparently as the enforcer during the reign of the much revered and hallowed Pope John to eliminate a liberation theology, which began, I believe, in Brazil and then spread across the continent. And he was the guy who purged, apparently, bishops and other high-ranking Catholic officials. Is there anything to that?
I mean, we don't know the inner workings of the Vatican, but that's what's reported. And it certainly looks like that from his writings. Actually, it's interesting that the U.S. Army takes credit for it. One of the talking points, of the School of the Americas is that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. But the Vatican played its role, ugly role, of the kind that you mentioned, and it's rather striking in the light of the history of the Church. I mean, the crime of liberation theology was that it took the Gospels seriously, and that's unacceptable. I mean, the Gospels are a radical pacifist material, if you take a look at them. When the Emperor Constantine, the Roman Emperor, took over, adopted Christianity, he shifted Christianity from a radical pacifist religion to the religion of the Roman Empire. So the cross, which was symbol of the suffering of the poor, was put on the shield of the Roman soldiers. And since that time, the church has been pretty much church of the rich and the powerful, just the opposite of the message of the Gospels. And liberation theology from Pope John XXIII and his influence in the bishops in Latin America, Brazil particularly, picked up the actual Gospels and brought it to peasants. They said, let's read it. Let's actually read what the Gospels say, and let's try to act on the principles that they describe. And that is a major crime. That set off the Reagan Wars of Terror, the Vatican repression, and so on. And the U.S. was virtually at war with the Catholic Church in the 1980s, and in its own way, and the Vatican in their way. It was a clash of civilizations, if you like. The U.S. versus the Gospels, including those who, posture about how Jesus is their favorite philosopher.
You mentioned the uprising in Oaxaca, which is continuing in southern Mexico, but the day that NAFTA went into effect, I was in the Yucatan at the time, it was January 1st, 1994, there was an uprising in Chiapas, the Zapatista revolt. Talk about what they're doing today. I know that Subcomandante Marcos is kind of the face, or almost the masked face of the movement, was campaigning around the country during the presidential election, advising people not to vote for either Calderon or López Obrador.
Yeah, personally, I'm not sure that was a wise position to take, but yes, that's what he did. I don't know the details, but as far as I can see, the organizing in Chiapas continues. The Zapatista movement remains alive. His role was quite significant, very effective use of the internet to create support systems which prevented the authorities, the very brutal Mexican police, from crushing it, and federales, and prevented the U.S. from moving in the way it expects. So they're still viable. I mean, how much it can influence the rest of it. Certainly it had an inspirational effect all over the world. That's you can find everywhere. Exactly where it'll develop in Mexico, I don't know.
There's a graffiti that found its way onto a postcard that you also used in the conclusion of the book Perilous Power that you did with Gilbert Ashkar. So apparently someone asks Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi replies, I think it would be a good idea.
Yeah, that's apocryphal. I mean, it's not sure that It's a nice story. Yeah. And you can say it about a lot of things. Say capitalism or free trade. Yeah, it might be a good idea. Who knows? We won't know until anybody wealthy and privileged is willing to give it a chance.
Well, in failed states, toward the end of the book, you do point out that often critics of the system are denounced for being negative and never having anything positive to put forth. And you address that criticism with some very specific suggestions about solutions.
Very unoriginal suggestions. Those suggestions just happen to be supported by a large majority of people in the United States. And I think they're good suggestions. They would change the country significantly. There's nothing radical about them, but they're off the agenda. That's part of the serious collapse of democratic institutions. I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about how it's a divided country. We have to bring it together, red and blue, the Baker-Hamilton commissions, bringing them together. It is a divided country, but not the way that's being discussed. It's divided between the public and the power systems, the government and the corporate system. Yeah, big gap between them. So these examples here are chosen from public opinion studies and are supported by, in most cases, very large majorities of the population. And I think they're all quite sound proposals. They can't be discussed because of the same gap. And in fact, talking about Bolivia before, it's rather striking to compare Bolivia with the United States. Actually, there's a lot of talk now in the liberal press, in the left liberal press, about how we have to do something about our electoral processes because you don't trust the voting machines and some people don't have a chance to vote and they don't count as fraud and so on. Yeah, maybe all correct, but it's kind of like a footnote. The real problem is we don't have elections. You don't have elections when the issues that the population is concerned about do not arise on the electoral agenda. In Bolivia, in contrast, they actually had a free election, a serious one, last year. Huge participation. Everybody knew the issues. The issues were important, but they didn't just come on voting day. They'd been struggling about those issues for years, like in Cochabamba, with the protests there where I think a couple dozen people were killed. There were mass popular organizations. They elected someone from their own ranks. That's an election. I mean, it's so remote from conceivability in the West, certainly the United States, that it's incredible. So yeah, this is one illustration of the enormous gap between public opinion and public policy on a host of issues, quite a lot of issues. And we see it every day. When I was driving home the other day and listening to NPR, my masochist streak, they happened to have a long segment on Barack Obama. Very favorable, really enthusiastic. I mean, this new star coming on the political firmament and so on. And this is going on for 15 minutes. I was listening to see if they're going to say anything about his position on any issue. Any issue. Nothing. I mean, just about the image. I mean, I think they may have had a couple of words about, he's in favor of doing something about the climate or something. What are his positions? Well, it just doesn't matter. And you read the articles, it's the same. He gives hope. He has an image of, I don't know what, he's just a wonderful, he looks right into your eyes when you talk to him. I mean, that's what's considered significant. Not, shall we control our own resources? Shall we nationalize our resources? Shall we have water for people? Shall we have health systems? Shall we stop carrying out aggression? I mean, no, that's not mentioned because our electoral system, our political system has been, not degenerate is the wrong word, it has been driven to a level of, to such a low level that issues are completely marginalized and the mechanisms are understood. We've talked about it. Elections are run by the same people who sell toothpaste. They market candidates the same way. You're not supposed to know the information about toothpaste. You're not supposed to know the information about candidates. And they don't. Take the congressional elections just in November. They're interpreted as kind of a referendum on Iraq. Population wants to get out. Well, maybe they were, but do you know the position of the Democratic candidates who were elected on Iraq? Maybe 2 or 3 of them. For the most part, you don't know what their positions were. We don't like it. That's a position.
It's not going well.
It's not going well. We're not doing too well. Let's do something. But was the voice of the population heard? No. Or take the next major issue coming up, Iran. And the population has an opinion on that, on the Iranian nuclear issues. I forget the numbers, but the overwhelming majority of the population is in favor of diplomatic initiatives rather than confrontation. I don't even think that's been reported. It's certainly not discussed. American public opinion doesn't count, just as Iraqi public opinion doesn't count. So take the Baker Hamilton, the ISG report again. It's quite interesting to read. It's mostly interesting for what it doesn't say. So one of the things it doesn't say is what the population of Iraq wants. It's never mentioned. Actually, it's interesting how they skirt it. They cite the U.S. government polls, U.S. government and other Western polls, which do tell us a lot about that. And they cite the polls, but not that. They cite the figure that says correctly that says that the proportion of Iraqis who think it's legitimate to attack American soldiers has increased. It's now a majority. And they cite that. And the conclusion is, well, we have to do something to readjust our tactics so they don't see us as occupiers or something. So let's make a tactical adjustment. Those very same polls, some by the State Department, some by Western polling agencies, say that in Baghdad, 2/3 of the population wants the U.S. troops out immediately. And the large majority in the country as a whole wants a firm timetable for withdrawal in less than a year or less, maybe 6 months to a year, something like that. Well, that's what the Iraqi people want, according to Western U.S. polls. That's not mentioned, just as the opinion of the American people on the issues listed here or on Iraq and so on is just not taken into account. Now, if you look at American public opinion, since I think April 2003, right after the invasion, a considerable majority, maybe around 2/3, here in the United States thought that U.S. forces should be kept in Iraq under the auspices of the United Nations, not leading the occupation. That happens to be the same position that the Spanish population voted on a year later. They voted for that. They didn't vote to withdraw. They voted to keep Spanish troops there only under UN supervision, position of the U.S. population, the majority. The difference is that in Spain you could vote on it. Here nobody even knows it because it's kept under such tight control. Well, that's deterioration of democratic institutions. And yes, there are plenty of positive policies which are very straightforward, and they come straight from majority opinion.
Now, let me just read them. Accept jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court, sign and carry forward the Kyoto Protocols, let the UN take the lead in international crises, rely on diplomatic and economic measures rather than military ones in confronting terror, keep to the traditional interpretation of the UN Charter, give up the Security Council veto.
That means no use of force except in self-defense.
That would be under Article 51.
Yeah, but real self-defense against the ongoing armed attack.
And the others cut back sharply on military spending and sharply increase social spending. I remember years ago you told me that the United States should be an organizer's paradise. Do you still see the paradise?
I still think it's an organizer's paradise, and a lot of good things are happening. I mean, you see them all over, so do I. Like the last talk I gave a couple of days ago happened to be in downtown Boston at the annual meeting of a wonderful group. It's called City Life Vida Urbana. They were opening their 34th year of organizing and activism in the poorest areas of Boston, mostly Latino, Black, and so on. Terrific group of people, a lot of people there. They were also very enthusiastic and lively meeting. It was also the opening of a 3-day conference of radical organizers from around the country who are doing similar things. All those things are happening. A lot of them, they're scattered. The numbers of people involved are very high, probably higher than the 60s, I'm convinced. But kind of atomized. The one real success of the power systems in the U.S. has been to separate people from one another, so you don't know what's happening. Actually, I knew very little about this group, though it's been here for 34 years, and very, very effective, right in my own city. And that's what you see.
You're talking about the Iraq War, and I dare say that among liberal opinion there's a tremendous opposition to it. But that you don't agree with that?
No, what's the opposition?
Well, it hasn't gone well. I mean, not on moral grounds.
It hasn't gone well, but what are they proposing? That it go well.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you could have found the same in Russia and during the Afghan years. Actually, a very interesting article that just came out in, I think, the Toronto Globe and Mail by a former Russian soldier who's now a Canadian citizen. I've been in touch with him. This is part of a bigger project he's doing. He's comparing the attitudes in Russia toward the Afghan war, the Chechnya war, and what appears in the press there and so on, with attitudes here and what appears in the press here about U.S. wars. And pretty much as I expected, it's very similar. So he describes how the soldiers felt in Afghanistan. He was one of them. And what the propaganda was like and so on. He said, he's describing his own experiences. He said, we were trying to help the people. We were carrying out, we were saving them from the terrorists who were attacking them. We were risking our lives to bring them medical care, and somehow they didn't appreciate it, and it goes on and on about the sacrifices of the Russians and their suffering and the wonderful things they're trying to do. We're trying to protect the rights of women, which is true, they were, and make it a civilized society and so on. You could translate it word for word. He says, now I hear Canadian soldiers saying the same thing.
Let me be a little tighter with my description then. Elements, let's say, of the left that are anti-imperialist and oppose the war from the very get-go on grounds that the United States was not threatened by Iraq. It was immoral to attack a country that was not an immediate threat to the country, to the U.S. They have nothing to say about Afghanistan.
The Afghan war is supposed to be a good war. Well, first of all, in my view, which is very unpopular, so I'll repeat it, the Afghan war in itself was a major war crime.
Explain how, because people say, well, we were attacked on September 11th. Didn't they come from Afghanistan? And that's where the Taliban were protecting Al-Qaeda, etc.
No, first of all, we don't even know that. 8 months later, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, was interviewed, had a big interview with the Washington Post, which he was asked about, what do you know about the September 11th attacks? And he says, well, we believe that the plot was hatched in Afghanistan, but it was probably implemented in the Gulf Emirates and in Germany. That's what we believe 8 months later, which means they knew nothing at the time of the bombing. The bombing was undertaken not to get rid of the Taliban. That was an afterthought added 3 weeks after the bombing. The bombing was undertaken, very explicit, said, you turn over to us Osama bin Laden, or else we'll bomb you. No evidence, no request for extradition. In fact, the Taliban made some gestures. We don't know if they were serious or not, because they were instantly rejected.
I think I got all the orange paint off my nose. I don't know if that was visible, but I smeared myself pretty good there. So anyway, that gets a pretty even distribution around the edge for some deepening reds. And as you can see, there's quite a few more cobbles left. So I'll vary the red tones and sew that up, and then start blending it into bright light blue towards where it's emanating out from its feet, and also redo the aura with a bright light blue very thinly closer to the skin that will fade into the purple that's already there, and then do a little more with the leaves, and then that one's pretty close. So for the moment, that is it. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting sundial.
In Peshawar, in Pakistan, of about 1,000 Afghans, many trekking across the border from Afghanistan, some from Pakistan. One was reported. They didn't agree on much, but one thing they agreed on was opposing the bombings.
Thank you, and have a good day, Earth.
Before the bombing,